So our church has been going through the book of Jonah the last few months, and we've called it the sign of Jonah because this is what Jesus mentioned, the term he used when he was referring to himself and who he is. He said, he referred to himself as the sign of Jonah. He is the sign to be given. And it seemed to be implying that if you really want to understand what Jesus is all about, his mission, who he is and what he came to do, then you really need to understand the book of Jonah. And if you don't understand who Jesus is, you really don't know what the book of Jonah is all about. Now, most people are aware of that comment Jesus made, and in their mind, they know that Jesus said something to the effect of, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will, they think be buried and then come up again. And there's some sort of connection between him being in the fish and then coming out of the fish and the resurrection. And so some people know that there's some sort of connection, but most people do not understand just how huge this connection is, and all the ways throughout the book. And in every chapter, there's so many things pointing to Christ. And even though I had talked through Jonah before, as we really slowed down and went verse by verse, I was surprised just how many things. I want to share a few of them with you now, and not exhaustive. If you think of some things that I do not share, please leave them in the comments below so I can continue to learn. But here's just a few. First of all, their very first verse, and the word of the Lord came to Jonah and said, saying. So it doesn't just say God said something to Jonah. It said the word of the Lord, so not just the Lord, but the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And then the word of the Lord said something to Jonah. So you have this entity, this person known as not just the Lord, but as the word of the Lord coming to Jonah. And then as he comes to Jonah, this word of the Lord says something to Jonah. Well, who is that? Well, certainly that takes us straight to John 1. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God and made flesh. And so Christ begins Jonah. The whole story of Jonah is about a Christ initiative, something he's doing to save the world, not just but the Gentiles, particularly. So that's the big emphasis, the salvation of the Gentiles here. So the word of the Lord comes to Christ. He comes to Jonah and he speaks. So we want to hit that. Then verse 2 begins with the word arise. That word arise appears a lot throughout the whole book of Jonah. Arise, 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 arise. Sometimes Jonah disobeys it. Other times later on he obeys it. In verse 6, a very powerful, when he's sleeping in the depth of the boat, the captain says, what does this mean, O sleeper, arise? Very unusual way of wording it, both in the Hebrew and if you're reading a more literal translation in the English. Some of the more paraphrased versions kind of smooth it out. But it's like, what is the meaning of this sleep that you as the man of God are doing? You need to be arising. And for a book that prefigures Christ's resurrection, this repeated drumbeat of the word arise, arise, arise is something that if you're studying it, if you're reading it, if you're using it for worship or study or teaching or preaching, you want to grab onto that word. Then you get to this, he goes down to Joppa. Now, so I'm talking about how Jonah points to Christ, but there's also this side parallel. So types are things that point to Christ, but sometimes there's parallels between different stories in different parts of the Bible. And there's just some remarkable stories, not just between Jonah and Christ, but Jonah and Peter, or St. Peter, depending on your tradition. And so Peter, now, for example, first of all, both of them go down to Joppa. That's a big deal. From there, both of them are called to the Gentiles. God speaks to Jonah, calling him to go to Nineveh. In Joppa, God gives Peter the revelation to go to the Gentiles. Both are reluctant at first. 3 times in chapter 1, it says, and Jonah fled from the presence of the Lord. And Jonah fled from the presence of the Lord. How many times did Peter deny Christ? 3 times. He denied it. Both of them were restored by Christ, and both of them re-sent out with a commission. Both of them sank in the water. Jonah is really sinking in the water. Peter sinking in the water. Both of them were pulled back up out of the water by Christ. Both of them were restored on a beach. Peter was restored by Christ on a beach while eating fish, and Jonah was restored on a beach covered in fish vomit. Both of them failed. Both of them rejected Christ. Both of them called to go back. Both of them sent to the Gentiles. Both of them, the city Joppa plays a role. If you go to Israel today, if you go to Joppa, you can actually see St. Peter's Church up there. We're a beautiful church right there overlooking the harbor of Joppa, and kind of right around the corner there's this big statue of a whale, of Jonah and the whale. So even architecturally in Israel today, you can see this connection. Okay, but that's a parallel between the stories, and there's more. I'm just for the sake of time, I'm trying to go quick here. So that's Jonah. How Jonah parallels Peter, but there's more in terms of actual typology and pointing to Christ. When Jonah's on the boat, and they're like, somebody here has done something wrong. What do? They're casting lots right before Jonah, quote unquote, dies. He's thrown off the boat into the sea, representing death. Right before he dies, what are the pagan sailors doing? They're casting lots. Right before Jesus dies, what are the pagan soldiers doing? They're casting lots. What does Pilate pray over Christ? I am free from this innocent blood. What do the pagan sailors pray? Lord, don't let this man's innocent blood be upon us. There's this appeal to God, or in Pilate's case, maybe more just general deity or morality. There's this appeal. Please don't let us be guilty of this man's blood. And all that is just in chapter 1. You get into chapter 2. The great prayer of Jonah says, out of the belly of the fish, and then out of the belly of Sheol. So chapter 1, it talks about the belly of the fish. Chapter 2, the belly of Sheol. There's two different Hebrew words. The first word is kind of vague. It means kind of just the interior, any part. At least once in the Hebrew Bible, this refers to the word womb. That would be in Ruth, the book of Ruth, where Ruth says to Naomi, do I have any more sons in my belly or in my womb? The next word is actually more specifically does mean womb. We tend to translate it as belly, but in the womb of death, in the womb of Hades, in the womb of the grave, I was. And this makes it so powerful then when he is spit back up in the boat, because he is really born again. Jonah is born again into a new man. He's experienced the mercy of God, and in a sense, Christ. Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, but all the Gospels go to great lengths to say the tomb had never been used. It was a virgin tomb that Christ was placed in, and 3 days later, he explodes out into an incorruptible life. He came out of Mary's womb into corruptible humanity, meaning he could bleed and get tired and all this, but he came out of the tomb incorruptible, never to die, never to feel pain, never to feel hunger, and so there's this idea of going down into death and then coming back out again, totally made new. The weeds were, this image he prays in the middle of the prayer. Weeds are wrapped. He's talking about the judgment of God on him, and one of the signs of this is that the weeds were wrapped around his head. Of course, this points to Christ, who had thorns wrapped around his head in judgment. And it brings us back to Adam's curse in Genesis chapter 3, where sin brings in Adam's curse. And it comes upon him, and what is the curse? Well, that the ground will bear weeds of thorns because of your sin. And it ends with the prayer at the great line. Salvation is of the Lord. In Hebrew, it's Yeshua, Yahweh, just the name of Christ and the name of the Lord side by side. Yeshua is of Yahweh. Getting into chapter 3 so much, there's this idea that it says Nineveh was a 3-day journey. Some people might think it's a coincidence that he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and that he was walking. It took him 3 days to journey throughout all of Nineveh to preach his message, to preach it to everyone. Well, that could be a coincidence, or it could be pointing to the reality, what Christ said, I will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days. As the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. Nowhere else does that refer to just being in like a surface level grave, but he actually descended, as we say in the creeds, he descended into Hades. Some say descended into hell, or he descended into the grave. There's some nuance there, but for our purposes, he descended into Hades. And you think of that, kind of those vague verses that, sometimes us Protestant evangelicals aren't entirely sure know what to do with. It's there, but we don't make much of it. But he descended, and he preached the gospel to those who were in prison, or he preached to those who were in prison. And so just as Nineveh, or just as Jonah is going through Nineveh and saying, Nineveh will be overthrown, Christ descends into Hades and says, death has been overthrown, hell has been overthrown, the powers of darkness has been overthrown, while Jesus' body is there on the surface of the earth in the grave. His soul descends to the heart of the earth, and he preaches victory, and he grabs a hold of Adam and grabs a hold of Eve and all their children and all the righteous, and liberates them into the presence of God. You then go on, the king leading his people, trying to save his people from the wrath of God, and it says he got off his throne, laid aside his majestic robes, and put on sackcloth, and he went and he humbled himself, so the city might be saved from the wrath of God. And man, that'll preach. Cue up, cue up a great worship song. At the end there, just Christ laying aside his majesty, clothing himself in frail humanity, that we might be saved. The city of man might be saved from the wrath of God. Again, in chapter 4 there, and Jonah becomes more of an anti-type. His whole attitude, he goes up over Nineveh to hopefully see it destroyed, and then he's angry when it's not destroyed. And you contrast this with Christ coming up over Jerusalem right before his death and weeping over Jerusalem because they won't repent. The exact mirror opposite image, Jesus and Jonah here. The strong wind comes from the east and blasts Jonah and kills the plant, and He complains where Jesus, he faced not just into a strong wind, but into the wrath and judgment, into hell itself, without any complaining. His mouth was closed. As Isaiah 53 says, he did not utter a word, of complaint. And he didn't just complain and wish he would die. He actually died for the salvation of the city. So these are just a few ways. If you think of some more, please leave it in the comments below. Love to hear from you. That's all. God bless. Like, subscribe, and please share. That's the way these things get out better later.